Good morning, and thank you for joining us. The topic for this panel is the Indian startup ecosystem disruptive enough? As we all know, Indian startups are routinely criticized for being copycat ideas of Chinese and Western companies. And even recently, Ratan Tata, who's actually been one of the more active angel investors of the past few years, said that Indian startups lag their Chinese and Western peers in disruption. So, I mean, disruption is anyway a very loose and overused word. So maybe you can start off by talking about what your idea of disruption is, and if you could cite maybe one or two startups that fit this idea. Kris?
First of all, MR, I'm quite sure that you say the same thing in every panel you introduce. It's a wonderful panel, right? Thank you for having us here. To answer your question, to me, you change the status quo. You change the way some things are done, not incrementally, but let's say exponentially. Completely new way of doing things, completely new technology, significant benefit to society. That's disruption. And I know it's kind of broad, because disruption can be technology, disruption can be business model, disruption can be impact on society, disruption can be scale, any one of these things. I see Geeta Manchanath here, so let me take Nirmay itself as an example of what I mean by this. Nirmay is in the area of breast cancer screening for women. The current technology has limitations of pain, touch, social challenges and things like that. So less number of women go for those tests and things like that. And you are also being radiated using X-ray, because X-ray is the technology that's used. So Nirmay has come out with thermal imaging, no touch. It can be done using a camera, behind a screen. So women don't have the taboo of facing the camera. And the results are as good and maybe better than the traditional techniques and technology that's used. So clearly, this is a disruption when it comes to the effective use of a technology to bring benefit to society, and doing it such that every woman can be tested, because there's no fear of radiation and things like that. So that is an example of disruption. Maybe next round you'll ask me what are the challenges, and I'll talk about them.
Sure. Sanjay?
Sure. If you talk to people in the Valley, they would use words like, going for moonshots, or, going after white spaces. Just to add to what Kris was saying, I'd agree with a lot of that. I'd say disruption is, we are in the business to back entrepreneurs that are disrupting anything, right? But I think if we thought about what defined disruption, it's really not incremental improvements, but really sort of massive, scalable improvements. I think one of the aspects of disruption is that people have always thought about disrupting sort of global markets or global ideas. And I think, like Kris was pointing out, I think there's such fantastic unmet needs back here in India itself that need disruption, that need technologies that disrupt that. So a couple of examples. We've backed a company called Stellapps, which is basically using IoT and sensors for the entire dairy, the milk supply chain. And they were just using statistics that I think India has, if I'm correct, something like 300 million cattle, which is really the entire population of the US. And so it's massive. We've done a very interesting company in the healthcare space called Tricog, which is like a virtual cardiologist and predicts, when a heart attack is going to occur. So these are just examples. There are many, many examples. And of course, our own gray-orange robotics, which is applying technology to a very traditional and a boring, but a massive space of automated warehousing. And just to, before we move to the other panelists, I think what is interesting is it would be wonderful to see disruption applied not just to global markets, but to those massive unmet needs right here, not just in the metros, but in tier 2, tier 3 cities in the real, Bharat in India.
Vani?
I know that in a classical sense, disruption is viewed as something massive, challenging the incumbent, and completely, perhaps our expectation overnight, a huge impact being created. And I think, from my perspective at least, disruption can be incremental and smaller steps. Sometimes the giant leap that we believe is there happens built upon many small steps that we don't necessarily perceive. 2 decades later, we can say Google, Facebook are very disruptive and we'll get there. I also think we forget sometimes, because we are very critical of Indian startup ecosystem at times, right? So, when Japan first started after World War II, they were just copycats. We dismissed them. Over a period, of course, they took the lead from innovation. Same with China, and a model like Mituan, which didn't exist anywhere in the world, they started, and now we study, and so on and so forth. So I think India will create its own models and disruption, rather than name one particular company necessarily. I think the whole India stack is a huge disruption, and that can spawn many things that puts Digital India forward. And it may not be one company, or it may be one company, but if it is, it's not clear who that company is today, but give it 2 decades, I think we'll be able to write the book on it, right? So, and I'm seeing a lot of young startups attack almost every industry from data sciences. Recently, we saw a company that is looking at the whole agri sector with some satellite imaging and data through which they are processing. Will they be successful? I don't know, but they're at least bringing very new thinking to how we can solve a very difficult problem. These are all, very friction-filled problem. Everybody understands the problem. The solutions are not easy. And the solutions to reach that massive scale probably need very new thinking and small steps of experimenting, a lot of failure before the real disruption can be visualized, again, on the shoulders of small steps that have been taken. So I think there's a lot of ground level disruption happening, and we are critical because we don't see that one big giant leap yet out of India.
But Vani, it's been 10 years plus of venture investing in India. So I mean, I'm sure you would have seen some of these companies take the small steps that you're talking about. So could you, out of the past 10 years, name like 1 or 2 that you've seen, who are on the right path?
Yeah, there almost every company that starts, you say they are on the right path. It's ultimately where the reach at the end of that path that matters. So to just take a very small company, we made a recent very small investment. They want to crowdsource transport vehicles to provide emergency care in terms of access to reach a hospital within 15 minutes if possible. And they're looking at it from a different kind of a Uber model to see if the same thing can be brought to healthcare, for example, right? So I think the idea is disruptive. Could they become a very large solution? From, in the end, delivery and execution is to be proven, and that's a very recent company. Right. But if you go back, much further, to me, I think if I look at learning, how do you do e-learning? I think Simply-Learn, one of our companies, started out with, there has to be a different framework to continue professional learning, and they've proven that you could do this online without requiring any, physical presence, and they're fairly large in their scale on a global perspective. Now, we don't see the B2B companies as much and call them disruptive here or anywhere in the world, because we only look at consumer companies from disruption. But I think there is disruption happening in almost every sector, but they may all be small steps versus a huge leap.
Got it. Rajan, you're, apart from being head of Google India, you're also an angel investor. So from that perch, which are the startups that you feel have kind of caused that disruption in India?
Yeah, so first of all, congratulations to the organizing team. It's great to be back at NPC, and it gets bigger and bigger every year. So I hope the last day was good and today will be good. Look, let me start with, what does disruption mean for me, right? Because I think disruption can mean many different things. It could be disrupting legacy players. It could be coming up with, step change improvements in products and services. So, I simplistically think of it as innovation, right? And if you think about startups or companies that are going to get built from India, right? They're either going to build for India or solve for India, or they're going to target global markets, right? So there are going to be different varieties. And by the way, so far we have this obsession to talk about technology startups. But they're a small segment of what's going to come, right? I think we just heard about life sciences. There'll be biotech, there'll be medtech, there'll be all kinds of things. I actually think the biggest, most disruptive companies in India will actually be offline businesses that leverage technology in very fundamental ways. And I'll talk about one or two of them, right? And they will really they will solve for India, right? I mean, the reality is, if you think about a nation, at the end of the day, startups basically get built by solving problems, right? Nice to have will never lead to a big company. You have to solve very fundamental problems. And a nation of 1.3 billion people, we have more problems than any other country in the world, by like orders of magnitude, right? Simple thing, takes an hour to get from the airport to here. Well, should it? Not really. 4 months ago, somebody announced a helicopter service. I was trying to find it this morning. My flight is delayed, right? It's not launched yet, right? So if I can launch a helicopter and give you a ride, let's just say for 300 rupees, from the airport to here, will you take it? I built $1 billion business right there, okay? So why do you have that problem? Because we crazy traffic, right? So I'm just this morning.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's not a problem for 1.3 billion people.
Build that business, right?
Sure.
But it's not like, you're not trying to solve next generation artificial intelligence. You're trying to get people from one place to another place without taking too much time, right? So I think that's a domestic, and then you have the exports.
Yeah.
The second thing I think is, to Vani's point, I completely agree. I think in 1990, if he had been sitting here, and if he had asked Kris and Anandan and Mr. Murthy and Azim Premji and all of them, is the Indian IT industry going to be worth over $100 billion of exports, and we create the most valuable company in India, by selling services to the US? Everybody would say, come on, you've got to be kidding me, right? First of all, I don't know whether you guys knew. I mean, in many ways, this is 1990. If you look at this generation of startups, consumer internet, machine learning, AI, B2B, biotech, I mean, this is 1990, right? So today you can look at Infosys and say, what an amazing company, TCS and so on and so forth. So I think it's very, very early. And I think the last thing is, look, in terms of startups, India is now beginning to really solve for India. And I think where we'll get major breakthroughs is by taking state-of-the-art technology and applying it to India problems, right, through business model innovations. And I'll tell you, the company that I think is among the most innovative in the world is Airtel. Airtel, despite what has happened in the last year, where prices have dropped dramatically, last quarter generated 32% EBITDA at 15 rupees a GB of data, right? I mean, that is incredible. That is incredible, right? With 200 million customers.
Yep.
Did they invent 4G? No. Did they invent 3G? Did they invent telecom equipment network? No. But what did they do? They said, look, to really explode the Indian mobile market, we got to deliver extraordinarily affordable mobile services at scale, and do it at a cost structure that nobody had ever seen it before.
Yeah.
And my view is that is the game in India, right? How do you first really big problems? I mean, I think both Sanjay and Vani talked about agriculture, right? 50 million farming households, all subscale. I mean, imagine what you could do, not just for each of those farming families, right? But what you could do for the nation, right? So I think we are beginning to see some of those companies, right? So for instance, Vani won't talk about her portfolio because I guess, as VCs you can't, right? But SignZ, I just met these guys.
But we are being modest.
Oh, you're being modest.
So,
okay, you're being
so
modest.
we asked
Right.
Rajan to
Anyway,
do that
so
instead.
let me pick two of them. Like one company. I'll just tell you, right? SignZ. So I don't know how many of you know SignZ. Very early stage startup. So if you're a bank today, all right, or a payments bank, NBFC, you want to sign up a merchant, it takes several days, right? Because it's a really cumbersome process. These guys basically built off the India stack. Vani talked about it. Nobody really understands yet, right, what this stack can do. It is very, very fundamental. If you think about GPS, it's GPS to the power of 10, right? So over the next 10 years, we're going to see some amazing. So what they do is very simple. They make you onboard a merchant in minutes. Yeah. Imagine that. Fastest 0 to million revenue SaaS company India is going to ever see. I'm just putting a target on them, I guess now. Because why? Every bank that you call on, it's like the 2-minute enterprise sell to HDFC. Sir, would you like to onboard a merchant in 2 minutes? Really? 2 minutes? And everybody wants to get merchants, right? everybody wants 10 to 20 to 30 million merchants. So is that an innovation? Absolutely, right? Now, is it going to be $1 billion of revenue? I don't know. To the point, we'll know in 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
You know, so that, and nobody talks about it, right? Because it's not, but it's a massive pain point that is going to generate a huge company. Another one is gray-orange robotics, right? It is very clear that every warehouse in the world is going to be 100% automated 10 years from now. And we have among the most state-of-the-art companies, robotics companies sitting in Gurgaon. Have you been? I mean, if you haven't been, when you're in Gurgaon, go and visit their office. Yeah. It is super inspiring. It's like Google 2005. It's literally like that. The whole environment's like that. You go into these labs, these robots running around. Have you been? Yeah. It's like really cool. So, you know, so my view is very simple. We're still early. We are going to build some amazing companies, but we are going to solve for India. Because I think, you know, I think it's sort of curious that we keep saying we're copycat. You know, copycat of what? Right? At the end of the day, if Indian consumers really wanted to buy product and you don't want to sit in traffic for 3 hours and you're buying e-commerce and the number one e-commerce company happens to be an Indian company, is that a copycat? I don't think so. You know, like...
Sure. So you're saying that there's already enough disruption over here.
At the end of the day, find consumer pain points or find business pain points and solve them with step change solutions, right? It's innovation.
Sure.
So,
sure.
Long answer.
Got it. Kris, just kind of continuing from that, do you think there are enough India-specific solutions that are being built, and what are the biggest challenges that entrepreneurs face, you know, in coming up with disruptive and executing these ideas?
So are there disruptive companies, disruptive ideas, disruptive business models? Yes. So I will come to the challenges actually. The first challenge I see is many of these companies face the challenge of regulatory hurdles. Many of them face the challenge of incumbents putting obstructions because you know these companies are going to challenge the incumbents. Third, many of these ideas are to be tried. You know, they have to undergo trials and things like that, which again may require you to, you know, go against the technologies that are in use today. You know, I'll take Anand Madan Gopal, who is also sitting here. He's got an ECG machine, but they have to go through trials, you know, especially in the healthcare space. Typically, what you will find is trials are as part of R&D. You go through trials before the venture capitalist or angel investor comes in. These trials will probably be over. But the startups are now, you know, going through the trial process and have to fund those trial process. And the investor now, you know, questions whether they need to support the trial process. What happens is the startup takes that much longer. So in the healthcare, probably it'll take 7 to 10 years to reach the goal that they want to reach. Venture industry back somebody who will take 10 years to create a scalable enterprise. So that's again a challenge. I believe that we need to look at grant funding. We need to look at translational research capabilities in our research organizations. And if you go to an MIT or a Stanford, there is a department which only focuses on translational research, you know, which takes research from the lab and creates prototypes that investors can fund. We don't have such an ecosystem here. The VC community, for right reasons, will not back these companies because they can't wait for 10 years to get their returns. So there are some challenges. We need to address these challenges. We need to also simplify regulations. We need to streamline. We need to give them better access to customers and things like that. So there are things that we can do. And we also need philanthropic funding coming into this space, because the grant funding typically comes from philanthropists who look at the social benefit and fund these things, maybe not based on returns themselves. Right. So there are many things that we need to fix in the ecosystem if we want to see more of these companies scale up. The ideas are there, startups are there, but we don't see them scaling up that rapidly. They take too much time to scale up.
Right. So let's talk about the current sources of capital, because like Kris says, that the problem is also that VCs don't have the long-term appetite to keep funding these startups. Do you think the VC mindset is a big challenge in kind of the Indian...
No, I didn't say mindset. I said they have a horizon for their
course,
fund.
the 10-year
right.
fund
They also
cycle.
have to satisfy investors.
Sure, sure. So do you think given that VCs are the biggest source of capital in India for startups, that is a big problem while coming up with long-term disruptive ideas?
No, and Mr. Kris is also a VC now, so you have many hats, so it's absolutely. A couple of things. I think there's no shortage of talent. We've established that. Sometimes there's no shortage of talent. If you look at the sources of capital, we need everything firing on all cylinders, right? I mean, I think if you look at what are VCs, it's a vehicle of investment, right? I know you all have K-Start. All these are just different pools. We've actually just onboarded an IBM veteran to kickstart a sort of acceleration, incubation efforts in just enterprise B2B. I don't think there's a shortage of capital. I think it is really, if you think of a startup, it's really, you've got limited money, it's a chance to run many experiments, right? And you want to go to where which has the biggest bang for the buck. So if you look at source of capital, I mean, we have domestic LPs also, like SIDBI and the others. Now, I agree with Kris where the government can play a huge role in funding grants, in university research, right? My own BITS Pilani, IT, the ITs. If you look at Singapore, the EDB gives grants, and we have a lot of our startups today, of course, going to Singapore sometimes for the right reasons, sometimes for other reasons.
But how do you get these people into the ecosystem?
No, if you look at our own government, I mean, we have so many task forces. I think the intent is there. It's just a question of doing it in India, right? If you look at, they want to support startups. There are so many different grant programs, and the thinking is there. Sorry.
No, sorry to interrupt. One data point, India spends 0.8% on R&D. We need to take it to at least 2%. That's what US spends. Korea spends 4%. Out of this, 50% should come from private enterprises, private industry. India spends 0.2% from private industry, 0.6% from government. Bulk of the private industry spending on R&D is actually on the prototyping and proving the model.
Right.
We don't have that because it's only 0.2%.
Right.
I think if you look at the gaps between how corporations and startups are interacting, I think the gap has reduced and improved a lot over the years, right? Today, many corporations have their own accelerators, incubators, or startup initiatives, and they're working much more closely with VCs and with startups directly. And all that helps, right? Whether it is grants, whether it is, in some cases, they're coming in as strategic investors. If you for the longest time, one would, going abroad typically meant only going west. If you look at the east, if you look at Japan, for instance, or you look at China or Singapore, there's so many corporates that are investing in funds, that are investing in startups, and that's very welcome, right? They actually want to back technology and they want to use it. I'll just add one final point before moving on. I think Rajan made a great point of some of the biggest beneficiaries of India would be traditional companies, manufacturing, warehousing companies, dairy companies that can really use technology. So I think many of these corporates have now a chief innovation officer, chief digital officer, that are actually seeing that it's not a nice to have, but if they don't work with startups, they're going to be disrupted themselves. And it's changed. We would definitely welcome much more source of capital, and I think even VCs within us, we're looking at sort of backing. We've always backed disruption, but looking at different areas and backing, more B2B, more non-traditional types of startups more.
Vani, you mentioned that disruption can happen in small steps, and then you build on top of that, right? So, guessing that takes time. Do you think, given the state of the capital sources in India, do you think that there is enough there to kind of support these kind of ideas?
See, Mihir, somehow we are always looking for easy answers to everything. We want to put them in neat boxes. The VC saw the problem, or the founders saw the problem, or the government is the problem, or something like that. Solutions are much more nuanced. And I think for real businesses, funding is always available, okay? And we have to figure out what that means, and I won't go into the period where you don't have a proof point, because science is different from business, and you do need science as a framework. If nobody had done any work on robotics, which was fed by a lot of grant money in India or abroad or wherever, and that research had never happened, gray-orange robotics cannot exist, right? So they can build upon something that is there. And to say that the VCs funding science, they cannot fund science. That takes over, whatever period. It comes out of NASA, it comes out of Israel military, it comes out of very many sources, out of which then there is an inflection point where Adobe gets created out of work done in Xerox PARC or something like that. Those are all the incremental steps. So if we don't have research out of India, let us say for a moment, or not enough of it, then maybe we can leverage that out of whatever, MIT Media Labs if you want, or from somewhere, right? Global research, apply it to India. The VCs come into play when there is a business value proposition. And we have to be very clear that's the role of VCs. But and capital is available once you have that business value proposition at various stages. It can be incremental. The same investors are not sitting on Google cap table over the last 2 decades, right? Or Tesla or anybody else for that matter, or Alibaba or someone. So it doesn't matter where the VCs sit and the next step of investors and the next and the next and the next. So there is a value chain of capital. But I think so the scaling to me, I think is one of the most important things. We have many disruptive ideas, but how do you get to scale on it? And again, I don't think there are any neat answers, much as we want to find that for life itself, and there isn't. So we know that. There are many problems. Maybe in collaborative dialogue, we solve for them incrementally, step by step, but I'll only address one of the problems in scaling, which is really leadership. Even if you are a great disruptive thinker like Larry Page, you had to make room for a Eric Schmidt or a Rajan Anandan or others to take that vision into a broad reality. And that takes a very different entrepreneurial journey of leadership, which requires your own first self journey. What is my ambition? What is my aspiration? In order to achieve that, what is the best path for me to achieve? And that has to come from within the entrepreneur. And it requires, like I said, a personal leadership growth, and hopefully along the way to make ventures and right people who can advise you along that path. And one of the things that's going to be important for us to convert these small steps of disruption into massive scale is going to be the leadership journey and maturity of the entrepreneurs. And that is something we have to work on in our ecosystem, because culturally, we don't have enough dialogue on. If you're a founder, do you have to be a CEO? And the moment there is a CEO change, it's kind of like front page news in every newspaper, and there is all kinds of interpretations about it. And don't know why that is relevant, because a leadership evolution has to be a natural part of the progression, and that hasn't quite set into our overall mindset. It doesn't mean that, and the moment you utter that, right, it's like, oh, that means you're going to change the founder CEO to some other CEO, you're not supportive of the founder. No, it's not like that. It is first and foremost the founder choice of that collaboration and journey. But I know one thing, if you have to build very large businesses and you have the ambition to do that, it's a multi-decade process. Along the way, there will be many people, shareholders included, that will come and go, leadership included, that will come and go, and you have to develop the maturity to stick to your vision and your ambition, and yet take all of the stakeholders along with you in that journey, and that's a different leadership journey. And I hope over the next decade, the depth of that journey and the maturity of that by bringing people together that enable this to happen is something we see.
Right. So you're saying that right now we haven't seen enough of that kind of the maturity in leadership of various companies in India.
I think we should see more of that. Let's look at that from a positivity that it can happen. We haven't had enough role models. We haven't had enough examples of it yet, and it has to come, because there will be enough entrepreneurs who say my vision and what I want to achieve as an ambition is bigger, and proving that is bigger than getting caught up into any temporary perception and optics that feel more important. And I think we will see that. It is something that we need more role models of and success stories of.
Right. Rajan, do you think on the capital side and on the leadership side, there's been, I mean, A, we have enough kind of patient capital, and B, do we have the leaders, or are we seeing leaders evolve into people who can carry out these disruptive businesses?
Yeah, I think, look, I think on capital, I mean, I agree with Vani, right? If you, there's enough capital. I mean, last year, I think you guys raised like what? Not you, but like collectively, I think the ecosystem raised $3 or $4 billion. That's just Indian money, not SoftBank, not Alibaba, not Tencent. Just Indian money. That's a lot of money, $3 or $4 billion is like per year. That's a sort of domestic capital raise now. I mean, India focused.
Sure, but talking about patient capital more than.
Look, this is all patient capital, no? What is 10 plus 2? I mean, come on. 10 years is patient capital, right? I mean, yes, would you rather? I'm sure they would all want to have perpetual capital, and maybe the world eventually will become a perpetual.
We don't, because there's a start and an end to everything. There has to be.
That's
right?
true. Okay. Anyway,
plus,
I actually thought
Rajan,
it'd be good.
Rajan, we don't have enough capital, because look at everything's beyond Series C. It's not funded by Indian capital. It's funded by foreign capitals. We don't have Indian capital.
No, so yeah, so I agree. I think that we should always have. What I'm saying is, look, let me tell you, as an angel investor, okay, because I'm at the very, I fund the 2 founders, in a garage who kind of have something, maybe not. That's the stage I fund at, right? As an angel investor, I'd like to see more founders solve for India, more founders trying to solve very fundamental problems, right? And I think, so that's on the, I'm not talking about scaling out leadership and all of that. That comes much later. Series C, Series D, all of that comes later, right? And I think especially here, because there are a lot of young founders, right, is I'd love to see more founders solving, India-specific problems or major, very difficult global problems, right? I don't know whether the Bugworks founder is here, right? I mean, super bugs are a big problem, okay? I mean, if these guys solve that problem, it's going to be like a $50 billion company. It's a really hard problem to solve, right? Now, is it easy for them to raise? They're trying to raise, I think, the next round. Is it easy? No, absolutely not. They're going around the world trying to raise because it takes a certain kind of capital with a certain kind of risk appetite. But so that's the first thing I'd like to see, right, is many more Indian founders or founding teams trying to solve these types of problems, right? I mean, think about it. I live in Delhi. I'm going to live 20 years less because I live in Delhi. Now it is proven. Because yesterday, PMI 2.5 was 500. And I spent 3 hours outside. So basically it was like smoking 120 cigarettes, right? So imagine you smoke 120 cigarettes every day for I've been there for 8 years, so I live 20 years less. Do you know how many pollution-focused startups there are in Delhi? I found one now. Unbelievable. Most polluted city in the world, and there's one pollution startup. But you know how many pictures I get still for on-demand X? So many. I don't want to do on-demand, man. I just want to live longer. Is that right?
Right.
No, I mean, think about it, right?
Of course.
So, I think that's an awareness. And by the way, the media can do a lot. Start writing about companies that are off the mainstream, that are trying to solve. I'm just looking at you because you happen to be the moderator, right? Like you all and all the other sort of media outlets, right? Because you can shape public perception. You can shape what entrepreneurs really focus. So that's one. I think
certainly can shape public perception. We know that.
No, they can, right? I mean,
positive or
I
negative
agree with
way.
Vani. What are these stories? Seriously, talk about the companies that are trying to solve big problems, right? Because that'll inspire. Because I think one of the reasons the ecosystem's got so much energy is because of what Sachin and Bini and all these other, like Bhavesh and so on and so forth have done, right? Because they've built really amazing first-generation companies. Now for this next generation, I think that will be good. I think the only thing with capital I'd say is, it would be great to have different kinds of capital, right? So for instance, I agree with Kris that you do need to, if you're going to really do some major breakthroughs in some of these new spaces, right? We do need, I don't know if there are $1 billion biotech fund, medtech fund, these funds that can put large amounts of capital into these sectors that are outside of, let's say, consumer internet,
right,
or B2B type of. So I think that'll be helpful. Last thing is, look, I think the government, I'm incredibly proud of what the government of India is doing for startups, right? Whether it's a 10,000 crore fund of funds, whether it's actually investing behind the India stack. I mean, I think 20 years from now, we'll look back and say some of our biggest companies only were built because the India stack enabled them, right? Much like without GPS, no Uber, right? Where are you going to, you can't.
Right.
So I think, so the government of India is doing a lot. This morning I learned about, all the Atal innovation projects. There are 1,000 tinkering labs. Imagine when we have 10,000 tinkering labs. So I think the government's doing a lot. I think a lot more can be done. And I think it goes to what Kris was saying. Let's invest more in research, both from public sector as well as private sector, right? Let's create more incentives. There's this thing called angel tax, you know. Like 50% of my startups now are being like, the IR, you know, tax department's coming after them. Seriously? No. You know, like, stop, right? So, you know, there's start and stop. So I think the government is doing lots of really awesome things, but it'll be great to stop doing some things like, you know, just drop the startup pursuit. I mean, they've raised 2 crores. They've burnt it already. You know, now saying, how did you come up with the valuation? Pointless question. Pointless. Right? So I think there are things that stop, but there's also a lot more that I think. So it's more from founders, I think more different kinds of capital, and I think from the government, continued on the momentum, because it's fantastic all the things they're doing. More of that.
Right.
You know, I just want to call out one other sort of elephant in the room, the Series C, D funding, and just only my personal perspective, of course. You know, what I hear when I spend a lot of time with various kind of growth investors, not just from India, but also, you know, outside of India, that are looking to want to put money into India, right? So from wherever the capital comes, it's great. I think one of the things that we haven't yet addressed fully is India has a certain interesting dynamic, which is neither fully entrepreneurial nor fully the old India corporate of a promoter. Only in India the term sheets still have this word called promoter, which you will never see in a Silicon Valley term sheet, right? And it has a legacy inheritance which is not actually relevant in India. So when I look at growth companies, so obviously we are not growth investors, but we want all our companies to get growth funding. So we spend a lot of time in helping our companies reach there. So from the other side of the table, and we have to look from both sides of the table to reach solutions and answers, right? So the question is, are there enough companies that have solid unit economics or a path that gets them towards, at some level, profitability, where the entrepreneurs are talking about it? It may not be profitable today, but they can show the unit economics, how it is going to get there, or is there a mindset of, you know, just give me money because I'm innovating, right? It doesn't work like that. So the growth investors, and then the valuations, expectations sometimes, without the necessary progress that has happened, just also gets many times wrapped up into, again, what I like to call this entitlement or optics. I must get this valuation. Why? You know, no other industry works like that. You know, from real estate to any other industry, it doesn't work like that. The value is what the market... No, let me finish. I need to finish, okay? I won't take very long. So, yeah. So, and I think, you know, and then there's always this notion of how much do the founders own? One reality has to set in. If you want to raise hundreds of millions of dollars and you start with raising that at a seed stage, you will never have substantive ownership of your company. And that is the reality, whether you're Elon Musk at Tesla, who owns 8 or 9% of the company, or anywhere else, right? And we get so caught up in that. I often see entrepreneurs, even this morning, a company I was talking to, I got a term sheet, but I rejected it because I really don't want to dilute. It's a chicken and egg problem. And then you have to build on your own capital for a far longer, bootstrap it, take it very far, and then get to capital when you're ready. But you can't start at the idea stage, go to Rajan, take angel capital, then go to Sanjay, take the seed capital, then come to Kalaari, take the next generation capital, and then go to SoftBank or whoever, and you will be at a sub 10% by the time you're done with this company. And you have to have a reality check. That is the path you have personally chosen, right? And so the growth capital today in India is stifled for valuation reasons, or, you know, expectation of ownership reasons, or for the fundamentals of the business model where, you know, in return for asking for that kind of capital, you're not showing the quality of unit economics that you need to have. And if all of those problems are solved, in fact, there is plenty of capital available.
Right.
Sorry, what were you going to say?
No, I was just saying, you're again making the point about there being a lack of maturity in startup leadership.
No, it is not maturity, it is just education. And I think over time, I mean, in 2006 when I came, you know, people didn't understand what a term sheet is. You'll be surprised how many people said, you give us money, it is not debt, we give you shares of the company, I'm not giving you my house, it's not a collateral. Seriously, you know, we saw a lot of that, right, in 2006. So, because venture ecosystem was very poorly understood. today, I didn't know as much as these entrepreneurs do when I took my first money on how to even read a term sheet, and entrepreneurs are very savvy. So it's just a process of education.
Sure.
It's not a process of maturity.
Right. Sanjay, just to kind of,
I wanted to just weave a couple of points, if that's okay with you.
Maybe you can. So there have been a shortage of exits in India very clearly. Do you think that plays a big role in the kind of appetite that investors have to, fund so-called disruptive ideas?
That was not the thought, but I'll respond to that. No, absolutely. I think we were just chatting earlier. I think if you look at it about 5-10 years ago, exits were few and far between. The path to profitability and therefore the path to exit has become better. I think it's interesting to see where the exits are coming from, right? If you did a survey in the Valley, in Silicon Valley, I think about 60 or 70% are typically M&A, and they happen between 3 to 500, not like let's say a billion plus.
Yeah.
But you have App Dynamics and a couple of other companies. I think the prospects are better. We see a lot of strategics coming in. Of course, Rajan was talking about the Alibabas and the SoftBanks are already here, but we're seeing a lot of sort of Valley tech, MNCs coming in. You also see Indian corporates. Obviously, there's an issue of pricing, so it will get better. I think the others can add more. I wanted to just add a couple of other points that Rajan was talking about. See, everybody on this stage is in the business of backing or writing about stories, right? You write about stories, we invest in stories, and the entrepreneurs are creating stories. Vani was also talking about this earlier. I think we have to also change the way we shape and write about stories. So for example, let's say a startup has raised 2 crores or raised 200 crores, or let's say gone insolvent. I think what's really interesting to talk about is the struggles and the actual stories that they're going after, the problems they're solving. I just happened to bump into Bhavish at Ola at Bombay Airport, thanks to, I think when flights get delayed, that's an added advantage. You get more time with the entrepreneur, unplanned time. And we were going through a couple of startups we are looking at, the bike sharing, ride sharing, and it was like a checklist. He's saying we're doing all of that. He said we'd love to collaborate with VCs around battery innovation, around electric vehicle. And I think so all those ideas of coming back to disruption are there, just a question of making it happen. And what's really interesting is entrepreneurs like Bhavish are open to working with us, so that's one. The other point is, I think our responsibility as ecosystem builders, as investors, is also to put our CEOs in front of those board members, those industry experts who can help that, to create those connections with corporates, which has traditionally been missing in India. But also I think it's collective responsibility, all of us as investors, also as the media, like we said. I think a different kind of reporting, writing about the actual stories that matter, right?
Right.
Solving.
Got it.
Mihir, sorry, on exits, can I make a point?
Please.
30-second point. 2 days back, there was a very short blurb about a company we sold for $75 million to a strategic public US company. And what was surprising to me is we get bombarded for comments on the wrong things. And first of all, there was no press leaks on this. So there is like no air coverage on it, which is fantastic. So it is possible. So you can imagine why leaks happen and why leaks don't. Until this press release was there, nobody knew about it, right? Which is a way transactions ought to be done. You don't play it out in media, and that would be the worst thing as an entrepreneur you can do. So one more tip. But, but when we put out the press release after the deal was all done, surprisingly, nobody called us asking, hey, that's fantastic. Give us a comment. What is the backstory? Let's write that on the front page. What went into doing this transaction? What are the takeaways? What are the learnings? There is zero press coverage on something like this. And we are talking about are there exits, are there no exits? So nobody, you can name anybody to not name. But, nobody. And you can go into ET and it's one small line. So, these are the stories that matter. And, for all the times that people ask me to comment when they know I won't comment, the one time I'm ready to share, how did this exit happen? What went into it? Nobody asks for a comment.
Got it. Do we have time for questions? Yeah, Kris, you wanted to make a final point?
All of them now talked about stories, right? I strongly believe stories play an important role in creating a right mindset and optimism about the industry, about the opportunities, about the economy, about leadership, everything. And so I'm going to promote a little bit of what I'm doing, promote NASSCOM. If you look at NASSCOM, it was built at the early days of the IT services industry in India, way back in the late 80s and early 90s, and I'm old enough to know all those things. Many of the people here probably were not even born. But that's the first wave of entrepreneurship in India. And that wave of entrepreneurship has created billion-dollar companies, multi-billion-dollar companies. The second wave of entrepreneurship and the second wave of IT services companies, which came, Mindtree is an example of that. They've also done fairly, some of them have done fairly well. So we have actually got examples. And this, I would say, is the third or the fourth wave of entrepreneurship that we are seeing in India. So I'm confident that we can create multi-billion-dollar companies, globally competitive and impactful companies. The IT services industry is $150 billion exports. If India is today very comfortable position in terms of the foreign exchange that we own, 400 billion, it's because the IT services industry brings in $150 billion of foreign exchange every single year. And now the promotion piece. Please go to the Itihasa booth outside. And we have documented the history of the IT industry. So this is storytelling. You will hear from people like Ramadurai, FC Kohli, Narayan Murthy, Nandan Nilekani, how the industry was built. Sorry for that.
Great, thanks a lot. So I guess the verdict was that India has disruptive ideas, but more needs to be done to kind of get them executed. Things like more mature leadership, more patient capital, and more kind of regulatory measures and positive stories, which include pointing out big exits as well. Thanks a lot.